Now, according to some, this ZX14R shouldn't be here. Kawasaki shouldn't have made it. I shouldn't have bought it. I definitely should never, under any circumstances, ride it on the street. It's too dangerous. In fact, it shouldn't even exist, because no one needs a 200 horsepower motorcycle. Years ago, I was a writer and contributor to several magazines. I never forgot the day one of my editors called me and gave me a critique of my first column for his magazine. He said something that changed how I approached writing then, but moreover, how I see writing and motorcycle advice now. You know, when an editor calls you unexpectedly, your mind tends to assume the worst. I figured he had found factual errors, maybe I'd missed a source, maybe I'd broken some style guideline I didn't know existed. He said something completely unexpected. He told me he loved the piece. He said he enjoyed the stories. He enjoyed the humor. The facts checked out. The grammar was solid. In fact, he said there was very little he needed to change. But then he paused, and he told me there was one editorial line I had crossed. Not a factual mistake, not bad writing. Something more subtle. He said, whenever you give your own personal view on a subject, you need to tell the reader that's what you're doing. I remember being a little confused. Now, he wasn't criticizing my opinions. He wasn't saying they were wrong. He was saying that opinions should never be presented as facts. Then he gave me one simple solution. He said, just start using the phrase, in this writer's opinion. That's it. One little phrase, 4 words, and suddenly everything clicked. Because the moment you write, in this writer's opinion, you've done something incredibly important. You've separated truth from perspective. You've reminded the reader that while your experience is valid, it isn't universal. That lesson changed how I approached writing. But years later, it also changed how I hear motorcycle advice. Because every day in the motorcycle world, I hear people presenting opinions as if they were laws of nature. You don't need a 200 horsepower motorcycle. You'll outgrow that 400 in a month. Real riders ride this. You can't ride a ZX14R on Daytona Beach. Okay, that last one is probably 95.5% solid. But most of these statements aren't facts. They're opinions that forget to identify themselves. They're unedited thoughts masquerading as universal truth. And depending on who those opinions are aimed at, even well-meaning, thoughtful, and genuine advice needs to be taken with a grain of salt, or taken under advisement at best. Today, I just want to talk about how I take an editorial stance to nearly all the advice I hear. I want to talk about how to self-edit the noise so you can find the truth that actually belongs in your story. Because, in this writer's experience, most of what you've been told is just someone else's fear wearing a disguise. I get that most people giving advice mean well. They're not trying to deceive you. They're simply making the same mistake I made as a young writer. They're forgetting to label their opinions. When you hear, no one needs a 200 horsepower motorcycle, well, that's a very broad and absolutely conclusive statement concealed in a very benign and appealing wrapper. It appeals to the sense of rationality and it feels like intellectual wisdom. But is it a fact, or is it an opinion? Because if we're being precise, nobody needs a motorcycle at all. You could argue nobody needs a convertible sports car. Nobody needs a watch that costs more than a hamburger. Nobody needs a guitar collection. Nobody needs a boat. You see, need isn't really the point. What people are actually talking about is their personal comfort with risk. They're saying, in my opinion, 200 horsepower is more performance than I could enjoy. That's a perfectly reasonable statement, but it's very different from declaring that nobody should own one. Some riders enjoy track days. Some riders enjoy engineering. Some riders enjoy mastering what others consider difficult machines. Some simply enjoy the experience of owning something extraordinary. The motorcycle doesn't care about the opinion. The motorcycle is just a machine. The judgment comes from us. The same applies to you'll outgrow that bike in a month. Even though well-meaning, I just kind of think it's impossible to conclude this for everyone, so I just hear them say, in my opinion, I would have outgrown that bike in a month. Now it's honest. Now it's accurate. Now it's a personal experience instead of a phony, universal truth. Because whether you outgrow a motorcycle depends on something far more important than engine size. I've often said, I am so glad I grew up in the time period I did. It was just so different. I think that's because our expectations were far more grounded. If my memory serves correctly, I was on a 125cc or less bike for the first 10 years of my motorcycle riding. What would today's experts say about that? I certainly don't regret 1 minute of those 10 years. Me, I would say a rider who spends 10 years enthusiastically exploring the woods and back roads on a small motorcycle isn't somehow failing or wasting money. I would say they might be building muscle memory and riding skills that will get them through the next 50 years of riding safely, eventually even on, dare I say, a bike that no one needs. I would say they're succeeding at a different objective. The advice often ignores the reader, and that's a major editorial error. Good writing always considers the audience. Good writing advice should do the same. Yet many riders have experienced the opposite, especially riders who don't fit the traditional stereotype. Younger riders being told they're riding something too bland. Women being told they're riding the wrong motorcycle. Old riders being told they're riding something too small or too big. Well, which is it? Everybody seems determined to edit everyone else's story, and almost nobody remembers to add the disclaimer, in my opinion. I think as we get older, we tend to naturally start tuning out the noise. We can read between the lines instinctually. We see through the wrappers that most advice candy comes packaged in, and we just don't buy it. Here's some good advice. Every time someone gives advice, mentally insert these 3 words. In my opinion. Then watch what happens. You'll never need more than 50 horsepower. In my opinion. That bike is too heavy. In my opinion. You'll outgrow that bike in 6 months. In my opinion. The moment you insert those words, the statement often reveals what it really is. Perspective, not law. Personal experience, maybe, but not fact. Now, this doesn't mean all advice is opinions. Some things actually are facts. Target fixation is real. Motorcycles require traction. Braking distance is increased with speed. Proper protective gear reduces injury risk. Those aren't opinions. Those are observations that can be tested and demonstrated. Projections tell you far more about the speaker than the motorcycle. Once you learn to distinguish facts from projections, something powerful happens. You get to stop treating every opinion like a commandment. You realize you have editorial authority. You don't have to argue. You don't have to justify yourself. You don't have to win a debate. You can simply reject the copy. Someone says you're too old for that motorcycle. Reject the copy. Someone says you're too young for that motorcycle. Reject the copy. Someone says that bike isn't serious enough. Yep, just reject it. The older I get, the more I believe that what I get from riding has less and less to do with motorcycles. Motorcycles are just the vehicle. The deeper lesson is about what I get, the freedom. It's about learning to hear your own voice clearly enough that the crowd stops drowning it out. Maybe that's where real authority comes from understanding your own experience honestly, from knowing what works for you, and being comfortable enough to let others do the same. Listening to advice and following it are two entirely different things. You know, that editor taught me something decades ago that I still carry today. Every opinion deserves a label. Every perspective deserves context. And every rider deserves the freedom to decide what belongs in their own story. Because at the end of the day, we are the editor-in-chief of our own ride. We decide what gets published. We decide what gets cut out. And you decide which opinions are actually helping you find the piece you're looking for. Hey guys, I want to thank y'all for watching these videos. Thank you for subscribing. Thank you for your comments, and we'll see you in the next video. Bye.